It was a chilly night in early March, a couple of years ago now. I had just gotten home from work. I was working late that night, so it was close to midnight by the time I walked through the door. I was beyond exhausted and wanted nothing more than to crack open a freezing cold beer and put my feet up on the couch. So that's exactly what I did. Alcohol always tastes better after a hard day's work. I didn't even turn on the TV immediately. I just sat there on the couch, eyes closed, feet elevated, trying to ignore the nagging thoughts about how stressful my life was. After a while, I started flipping through the channels, getting frustrated because nothing was catching my eye. I sifted through for a few more minutes, then finally gave up and decided to enjoy my beer in silence. But like everything else in my life, peace and quiet was apparently too much to ask for. Not 10 seconds later, all the lights in my house simultaneously shut off. You know that slightly fuzzy popping sound that comes a split second before everything shuts off? Yeah, there's nothing I hate more than hearing that noise. For some reason, our house had a tendency to lose power every so often. And now that I think about it, it still does. Anyway, my first reaction was to step outside and see if any of the neighboring houses were affected. I stepped outside and shut the door behind me, trying to preserve whatever heat I might not be able to get back if I failed to restore the power. It was late, but I remember seeing at least one house on my block with their lights on, which confirmed that the problem was only with my house. I took a deep breath, already feeling the headache of what was to come. I turned back to go inside, but when I reached for the handle on the front door, it wouldn't budge. I froze, confused. I tried the handle a few more times, but it was definitely locked. What the hell? I muttered to myself. I banged on the door, calling my wife's name, thinking maybe she'd woken up without me realizing. But there was no answer. I tried to peer through the glass, but it was pitch black inside. I ran around to the back of the house, but that door was locked too. At this point, I started panicking. My wife usually left doors unlocked, so it was strange that the back door would be locked. Then, as I moved towards the side of the house to check the breaker, I froze. My hose, which I knew for a fact had been coiled, was now laying in the grass just below the breaker box. The realization hit me like a freight train. Someone had cut the power intentionally. Without thinking, I sprinted to the nearest window and looked inside. This time, I could make out two flashlights swinging around wildly in the dark, as if two people were rummaging through my house. They were stealing. I was infuriated. The nerve of someone to do this while I was literally home. I reached into my pocket to call the police, only to realize I had left my phone on the couch. Cursing under my breath, I decided I would run to the neighbor's house and borrow his phone. But as I started making my way to the nearest house, another thought hit me, even more chilling. My wife was still inside. She was probably asleep, vulnerable to whoever was in the house. I couldn't leave her there, even for another minute. I sprinted back to my house, grabbing some loose rocks from the yard and chucking them at our bedroom window, hoping to wake her up. After the third rock, she opened the window. Before she could say anything, I quietly told her what was happening and instructed her to hide in our closet. She disappeared immediately without asking questions. Then I ran to my neighbor's house, banging on the door and explaining the situation as quickly as possible. I used his phone to call the police. I waited on his porch, praying my wife would be okay. When the police finally arrived, I ran to one of the cars and explained everything. They barged into the house, but by then it was too late. The back door was wide open, and whoever had broken in was gone, along with too many of our valuables to count. My wife was more shaken than I was, and understandably so. What she told me and the police made me feel sick with guilt for not being there to protect her. To this day, I'll never forgive myself for leaving her in the house with potential murderers. Apparently, mere seconds after I instructed her to hide, she heard someone kick the bedroom door open. The intruder walked into the room and cocked a gun, standing there silently, as if listening for anyone in the room. She said she had never been more terrified in her entire life. I believe the intruders heard me throwing rocks at the window, which is why they left. The scariest part is that we still live in this house and aren't planning to move anytime soon. Sometimes I think about what could have happened if I hadn't stepped outside for those brief moments. Sometime later, I moved back in with my parents. I had been struggling for years to find stability, and going back home felt like a step backward. But I didn't have many other options. I stayed in the basement to keep out of their way as much as possible. It wasn't too bad down there. It was almost like a mini apartment. I had my own little kitchen, bathroom, office, bedroom, and even a TV with my old video games. One night, it must have been either Friday or Saturday, there was a nasty storm raging outside. Rain hammered against the windows, and the wind rattled the whole house. I can't overstate the intensity. It was one of the wildest storms I'd ever seen. My parents were out of town, so I had the place to myself, which was fine by me. I was about to fall asleep to the sound of the storm when the power suddenly went out. Everything clicked off at once, leaving me in total darkness. I groaned, annoyed. I figured the storm must have knocked out the power, and I thought about checking the breaker. But I didn't feel like dealing with it, not with the storm raging outside. I figured I'd just wait it out until morning. As I lay there trying to get comfortable again, I heard something, a loud, unnatural thud against one of the basement windows. It sounded heavy, like something had hit it hard. My first thought was maybe a branch had come loose or a tree had fallen, but the sound was sharp and deliberate, unlike anything I'd heard before. Reluctantly, I got out of bed and grabbed my phone, using the flashlight to make my way to the window. As I held my phone up to the glass, squinting into the darkness, I nearly died of shock. There was a man's face pressed up against the window, staring right at me. His eyes were wide, his skin pale and drenched, and for a split second he made direct eye contact with me. As soon as he saw me, he moved away from the window. My heart started racing and I could barely breathe. I didn't have much time to process what I'd seen because a few seconds later, I heard another sound. The sound of footsteps above me. I was home alone, and my house was literally being broken into. I checked my phone, ready to call the police. But then I remembered the power outage had knocked out the Wi-Fi, and with no cell service in the basement, I was trapped. I knew I couldn't just sit around and wait for them to come down. I made my way to the basement stairs as quietly as possible. When I reached the top, I peered around the stairwell and saw 3 figures with flashlights moving through the pitch-black house. I watched them, petrified, as they murmured to each other in low voices. That's when I heard one of them say something that made my blood run cold. "Alex is in the basement. Go find him." They knew my name. I backed down the stairs, trying to keep my breathing steady. They were coming for me. I looked around frantically, considering potential hiding spots, but there wasn't time. The only way out was through one of the basement windows, but they were sealed from the inside. Desperate, I grabbed a nearby stool, climbed up, and smashed the glass with my elbow. I scrambled through the broken window, pulling myself out into the rain, and ran. When I was a safe distance from the house, I finally got a signal and called the police. By the time they arrived, whoever had been in the house was gone. So much was stolen that I can't even list everything. The power outage had been intentional, no surprise there. My parents were livid and nearly kicked me out, but I insisted there was nothing else I could have done. They eventually calmed down, but I'm still shaken by it to this day.